This is the conversation that should be happening right now, but it's not. You leave the service, the uniform comes off, and you're told, "Don't worry, the VA will take care of you." You're told that all those promises made during your transition briefings, those glossy brochures, are real. You're ready to start your civilian life, maybe go to school, maybe start a family. And you walk into the VA system for the first time, expecting a safety net, expecting gratitude, expecting the process to be straightforward. But what you actually encounter is a labyrinth designed by Kafka, managed by algorithms, and constantly shifted by reforms that look great on paper but are absolutely crushing the first-time veteran. We're not talking about the old guard who figured the system out decades ago. We're talking about the men and women who separated yesterday, who are trying to file their very first claim, who are trying to get their first mental health appointment, and who are finding that the rules of the game have fundamentally changed. And what nobody is talking about is how these well-intentioned, often highly publicized reforms are creating new, unexpected, and devastating barriers for the newest members of the veteran community. We need to dissect these changes because ignorance here isn't bliss. It's the difference between stability and financial ruin. The first and perhaps most insidious change that is quietly redefining the VA experience for new veterans is what I call Yamavi, the new gatekeeping, increased scrutiny on initial disability claims. For decades, the system operated on a principle of presumptive connection, especially for common service-related injuries. If you served in a certain place during a certain time and you had common ailments like tinnitus, knee issues, or back pain, the assumption was often weighted in your favor, provided you had documented evidence from service. The goal was to expedite care and compensation. But recent reforms, driven by a need to control costs and manage the massive influx of claims, especially high-value claims, have instituted a level of scrutiny on the initial filing that simply did not exist 5 or 10 years ago. This isn't just about the PACT Act, which we'll get to, but about the general attitude toward new claims. Veterans are finding that the initial compensation and pension, or C&P, exams are far more adversarial, far more rigorous, and far less forgiving of incomplete documentation. The VA is now leaning heavily on the nexus letter requirement, demanding explicit, detailed medical opinions, linking current conditions directly to service events, even for conditions that historically were accepted with less friction. Think about the first-time filer. They are overwhelmed. They're dealing with the stress of transition. They don't know what a nexus letter is. They rely on the VA's internal VSOs, who are often overworked and undertrained in the nuances of these new, heightened standards. The result? A massive spike in initial claim denials. These aren't denials based on fraud. These are denials based on procedural gaps and lack of sophisticated medical evidence that the average 23-year-old veteran simply doesn't know how to procure. They are getting rejected, and then they have to enter the appeals process, which adds months, often years, of delay to the benefits they desperately need to stabilize their lives. This delay is the silent killer. It means they postpone necessary surgeries, they struggle to pay rent because their expected income stream is delayed, and they sink deeper into the mental health challenges that often accompany transition. The gate is narrower now, and the first-time veteran is the one struggling most to squeeze through. They hear stories from older vets about how easy it was to get 10% for their knees, and they can't understand why their perfectly documented shoulder injury is being rated at 0 or outright denied. The standard has been raised, the burden of proof has been subtly shifted, and nobody in the mainstream media is reporting on the sheer volume of initial frustration this is causing. It is a systemic tightening that disproportionately impacts those who are least equipped to fight back. The problem compounds because the VA is now using sophisticated data analytics to flag claims that deviate from statistical norms. If a high percentage of new claims from a certain unit or base are suddenly requesting high ratings, For a specific condition, the system automatically flags those claims for additional, deeper investigation. While this sounds like a good way to prevent fraud, for the legitimate first-time claimant, it means their claim is now viewed through a lens of suspicion simply because they happen to transition during a period of high claim volume. The bureaucracy is fighting back against the sheer numbers, and the casualty is the individual veteran who is trying to do everything right. They are forced to become instant experts in medical coding, legal jargon, and evidentiary standards, all while trying to hold down their first civilian job or manage the demands of college. The gatekeeping is not malicious, but its effect is devastatingly exclusionary, creating a huge chasm between the veteran's service and the recognition of their sacrifice. This requirement for perfection in the initial filing process, a requirement that veterans are not adequately trained to meet, is the first major hurdle that is causing unprecedented levels of stress and financial instability for this new generation. We are setting them up for failure by demanding a level of expertise that only specialized, expensive consultants can usually provide, which leads us directly to the next catastrophic consequence. Now, let's talk about the PACT Act paradox, overwhelming the system and delaying non-PACT claims. The Honoring Our Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxics Act, or PACT Act, is undeniably one of the most significant and necessary pieces of legislation for veterans in decades. It expanded eligibility for benefits related to burn pits, Agent Orange, and other toxic exposures, finally acknowledging the long-term suffering of millions of veterans. This is a good thing, but every massive wave of claims, no matter how righteous, creates an immediate, crushing bottleneck in an already strained system. The paradox is this: the PACT Act, designed to help veterans, is simultaneously causing significant, often multi-year delays for first-time veterans filing claims for conditions not covered by the PACT Act. Imagine the VA claims processor. They have a finite workload capacity. When the PACT Act passed, millions of veterans who had previously been denied or hadn't bothered to file suddenly became eligible. The VA rightly prioritized these claims, often assigning dedicated teams and resources to process the massive backlog of toxic exposure cases. Where did those resources come from? They were pulled from the general claims pool. This means that if you are a first-time veteran filing for a service-connected ankle injury, or PTSD, related to a specific combat deployment that falls outside the PACT Act's presumptive list, your claim is now sitting behind hundreds of thousands of PACT Act claims. The processing time for these routine first-time claims has skyrocketed. Before the PACT Act, a first-time filer might expect a decision in 6 to 9 months. Now, 18 months to 2 years is becoming alarmingly common in some regional offices. This is the hidden cost of necessary reform. The new veteran who filed their claim immediately upon separation is watching their peers who separated years ago receive massive retroactive payments under PACT, while their own claim for basic service-connected issues languishes in the queue. This isn't about resentment, it's about life planning. A veteran relying on that compensation to supplement their low-paying entry-level job or to afford specialized medical equipment is now forced to wait years. They might have to take on high-interest debt, delay starting a family, or abandon educational plans because the financial stability they were promised has evaporated into a bureaucratic black hole. The PACT Act is a moral imperative, yes, but its implementation has created a two-tiered system where the immediate needs of the newest veterans are being sacrificed at the altar of historical justice. We need to acknowledge that the VA has not been adequately staffed or modernized to handle both the historical injustice correction and the ongoing, daily influx of new veterans simultaneously. The paradox means that the very system designed to support all veterans is inadvertently failing the newest generation by forcing them into an impossible waiting game. The psychological impact of this delay cannot be overstated. When a veteran transitions, they often experience a sense of loss of identity and purpose. Filing a claim is often the first step in acknowledging their physical and mental wounds and seeking validation for their service. When that initial attempt is met with silence, or worse, a form letter stating your claim is pending due to high volume, it reinforces the feeling of being forgotten and undervalued. This isn't just a delay in money, it's a delay in dignity. The longer the wait, the more likely the veteran is to give up, to assume the system is rigged, and to withdraw from seeking the help they need. This PACT-ACT paradox is creating a silent crisis of disillusionment among those who have just sworn off their obligation to the military, leaving them stranded in the uncertainty of an indefinitely delayed future. This overwhelming volume, while necessary, has fundamentally broken the timeline for the newest veterans, demanding a level of patience and financial resilience that most transitioning service members simply do not possess. This is a critical failure of resource allocation that is being ignored because the PACT-ACT narrative is so overwhelmingly positive. Next, we must address the mental health maze, shifting focus from immediate care to long-term programs. Historically, a veteran struggling with acute mental health issues immediately post-separation could often access rapid, localized care through their nearest VA facility or community care program. The emphasis was on stabilizing the crisis and providing immediate, accessible counseling. Recent reforms, however, have heavily prioritized centralized, specialized, and long-term mental health programs. These reforms are often framed as improving the quality of care by offering cutting-edge treatments for severe PTSD, military sexual trauma, MST, and substance use disorder. And while those specialized programs are vital, the shift in focus has created a massive, unintended gap in entry-level mental health access for the first-time veteran. Imagine a young veteran struggling with the first signs of anxiety or depression after leaving the structure of the military. They don't need a 90-day residential program. They need to see a therapist next week. But because the VA system is now funneling resources and providers into these high-demand, specialized centers, the availability of general outpatient mental health services has plummeted in many areas, particularly rural and suburban locations. The first-time veteran is told, "We can get you into group therapy in 6 weeks," or "The next available intake appointment is 3 months out." They are pushed toward telehealth options, which can be fantastic, but often lack the immediate, personal connection needed during a vulnerable transition period. The reform is built on the premise that severe mental health issues require intense, specialized intervention, which is true. But it overlooks the fact that the vast majority of new veterans need preventative and early intervention care to prevent those issues from escalating. By prioritizing the severe end of the spectrum, the VA has inadvertently created a massive wait list for the entry-level care that could stabilize thousands of transitioning veterans before they reach a crisis point. This is the mental health maze. You have to be sick enough to qualify for the high-end programs, but if you're only moderately struggling, the system has effectively ghosted you. Furthermore, the bureaucratic hurdles for obtaining community care, the ability to see a private therapist outside the VA network, have become increasingly complex. Reforms intended to streamline community care have in practice made it a logistical nightmare. The first-time veteran doesn't know the intricate rules for eligibility, the required authorizations, or the specific codes needed for billing. They are often bounced between the VA scheduler and the community provider's office, leading to frustration, denied appointments, and ultimately the veteran giving up on seeking help entirely. This is a life-or-death issue. We are creating a system where the newest veterans, already struggling with the isolation of civilian life, are finding the doors to immediate, accessible psychological support locked, forcing them to wait until their condition deteriorates to a point where they qualify for the high-priority, long-term programs. The shift in focus has created a tragic gap in the continuum of care, leaving the most vulnerable population, those fresh out of service, to navigate their initial mental health struggles alone. This is not reform. This is a failure of prioritization that is actively endangering the mental well-being of our newest veterans. And the data on delayed access is screaming this truth, even if the public dialogue is focused solely on the success stories of the specialized programs. The conversation must shift to the accessibility of basic, immediate counseling, which is the foundational support that has been severely eroded by these resource shifts. Moving on, let's examine the education benefit cliff, changes to BAH stipend calculations, and housing instability. The post-9/11 GI Bill is perhaps the greatest benefit offered to modern veterans, providing a pathway to education without the crushing debt faced by their civilian peers. It's supposed to be a golden ticket, but recent reforms and subtle regulatory changes, often tied to cost of living adjustments and enrollment verification systems, have created a volatile financial environment for first-time student veterans, pushing many into housing and food insecurity. The core issue lies in the calculation and timing of the monthly housing allowance, or MHA, often referred to as BAH, based on the military's term. The VA has implemented stricter, faster verification systems for enrollment and attendance, which is designed to prevent fraud and overpayment. Again, good intentions. But for the first-time student veteran who is learning how to navigate college registration, course drops, late financial aid disbursements, and the VA's sometimes clunky verification portal, these stricter rules create immediate and severe financial penalties. If a certification is late by even a few days, or if there is a minor discrepancy in their enrollment status, the MHA payment, which for many is the primary source of income for rent, can be delayed by weeks or even months. Imagine a veteran starting school in August, signing a lease based on the guaranteed MHA payment. If the VA payment is delayed until October due to a bureaucratic snag, a late form from the school, a verification error, that veteran immediately faces an eviction notice. They don't have savings built up. They are relying on that monthly stipend as if it were a paycheck. The reform meant to increase efficiency has created an environment of zero tolerance for administrative errors, placing the entire burden of perfect timing on the shoulders of a student who is already struggling to adapt to the academic world. Furthermore, the ongoing struggle with the VA's modernization of its processing systems has meant that while the rules are stricter, the internal processing speed hasn't kept up. We see repeated instances of retroactive changes to MHA rates based on old data, leading to surprise debts owed back to the VA, the dreaded VA debt letter. For a first-time veteran, receiving a letter demanding repayment of thousands of dollars they already spent on rent and groceries is financially catastrophic and psychologically demoralizing. They followed the rules, they attended class, and yet, due to a bureaucratic error months prior, they are now indebted to the very organization that promised support. The education benefit cliff isn't about the benefit itself. It's about the instability of its delivery. The VA has failed to implement a robust, forgiving buffer system to protect new students from administrative delays. These subtle technical reforms, focused on reducing waste, are inadvertently creating housing instability, increasing food insecurity, and adding an unbearable layer of financial stress that often leads first-time veterans to drop out of school entirely. The promise of the GI Bill is being undermined not by malice, but by overly rigid, poorly implemented efficiency measures that fail to account for the reality of the student veteran's precarious financial position during their initial transition. The conversation needs to shift from "the GI Bill is great" to "how many student veterans are facing eviction this semester because of a 3-week payment delay." That is the reality these reforms have created. The fifth critical impact, and one that absolutely demands immediate attention, is the third-party scourge. The rise of unregulated claims consultants, the exploitation. As the VA system has become more complex, more adversarial in initial claims, and slower due to the PACT Act volume, a dangerous vacuum has been created. Into this vacuum have rushed unregulated, for-profit claims consulting companies, often misleadingly branding themselves as veteran advocates or claims coaches, who charge exorbitant fees, sometimes 20% to 40% of a veteran's retroactive benefits, or even future benefits, in exchange for helping them file a claim. This is a direct result of the new gatekeeping we discussed earlier. When the VA makes the initial filing process so difficult that a first-time veteran feels they must hire a professional to achieve the required level of evidentiary perfection, they become ripe targets for exploitation. Historically, veteran service organizations, VSOs like the VFW, American Legion, or Disabled American Veterans, DAV, provided this claims assistance for free. But VSOs are overwhelmed, underfunded, and often struggling to keep up with the sheer volume and complexity of the new regulations. The first-time veteran, desperate and confused, finds these for-profit companies through aggressive social media marketing. These companies promise guaranteed high ratings and rapid processing. They often skirt or outright violate federal law regarding who can charge for claim assistance, exploiting loopholes related to coaching or medical consulting rather than direct claims representation. The veteran signs a contract they don't fully understand, often agreeing to pay a massive chunk of money that should have been their financial lifeline. The devastating impact on the first-time veteran is twofold. First, they lose thousands of dollars, money they need for housing, medical bills, or education, to a company that often provides substandard or boilerplate work that a VSO could have done for free. Second, and more critically, these unregulated companies often encourage veterans to exaggerate or fabricate symptoms to increase their rating, putting the veteran at risk of future fraud investigations and undermining the integrity of their legitimate claims. When the VA eventually cracks down on these consultants, which they are starting to do, the veterans who use them will be caught in the crossfire, facing potential benefit reductions or re-examinations. This rise of third-party exploitation is the clearest signal that the VA system, through its own complexity, has created a market for predatory behavior. The reforms have not adequately protected the newest veterans from this financial harm. The VA needs to aggressively simplify the initial claims process and simultaneously provide massive funding and support to the accredited free VSOs so that every first-time veteran has access to ethical expert assistance without having to mortgage their future benefits to an unregulated consultant. The silence around this issue is deafening because these companies spend heavily on marketing, drowning out the warnings. But for the new veteran, signing that contract is often the first major financial mistake of their civilian life, a mistake born entirely out of the complexity and delay baked into the current VA system. This exploitation is a systemic symptom that demands an immediate regulatory cure. Next, we must analyze the digital divide, mandatory online portals, excluding older rural vets. In the push for modernization, the VA has rapidly shifted many core services, from scheduling appointments to filing supplemental evidence to mandatory online portals, primarily va.gov and the associated apps. On the surface, this is efficient and necessary for the 21st century. However, this aggressive digitization is creating a significant, often overlooked barrier for two key demographics within the first-time veteran population: those who separated years ago but are only now filing their first claim, often due to the PACT Act, and veterans transitioning into rural or low-connectivity areas. The assumption is that every separating service member is tech-savvy and has reliable, high-speed internet access. This is patently false. Many older veterans, or those who served in earlier conflicts and are only now filing, are unfamiliar with complex digital interfaces. They struggle with creating secure accounts, navigating multi-factor authentication, and uploading documents in the required format. The VA has dramatically reduced the availability of in-person support and paper filing options, effectively forcing these veterans into a digital maze they cannot navigate. For the veteran transitioning to a rural area where housing costs might be lower, but internet infrastructure is poor, the mandatory reliance on high-speed internet for everything from telehealth appointments to checking claim status is a major barrier to access. Imagine having to drive 45 minutes to a public library just to upload a single document related to your disability claim. This is not hyperbole. It is the daily reality for thousands of new veterans. The reforms are designed for a perfect, digitally fluent user who lives in a major metropolitan area with gigabit fiber. They are not designed for the reality of the veteran population. This digital divide is not just an inconvenience, it is a mechanism of exclusion. It means the veteran who needs help the most, the one who is isolated, rural, or less technologically adept, is the one most likely to fail to submit critical documentation on time, leading back to the denial and delay cycle we discussed earlier. The VA's push for efficiency through digitization has inadvertently created a new form of systemic discrimination where access to benefits is now tied directly to digital literacy and geographical location. The tragedy here is the lack of a robust, well-publicized alternative. While paper filing still technically exists, the process is so slow and discouraged that it effectively pushes veterans toward the digital system. The VA has failed to invest in adequate local, in-person support staff, the people who could sit down with a veteran and help them navigate the portal, because the focus is on centralized digital infrastructure. The first-time veteran, especially if they are not fresh out of service, is left feeling abandoned and defeated by a system that demands they become a tech expert just to prove their service-connected injury. This reform, while modernizing, is actively widening the gap between the VA's capability and the veteran's accessibility, making the process feel impersonal, frustrating, and ultimately insurmountable for those on the wrong side of the digital divide. Finally, we must talk about the burnout factor. VA employee turnover and the impact on case consistency. This is the internal crisis that directly translates into external failure for the first-time veteran. The VA system is currently operating under immense pressure. The packed act volume, the complexity of new rules, the push for digital transformation, and the constant political scrutiny have led to historic levels of burnout and turnover among VA employees, especially claims processors, schedulers, and benefits counselors. Why does this matter specifically to the first-time veteran? When an experienced claims processor leaves, they are replaced by a new employee who is often inadequately trained and struggling to grasp the rapidly changing regulations. The first-time veteran's claim is often the most complex because it involves establishing the initial service connection, which requires deep institutional knowledge and careful review of service records. An experienced processor knows exactly what evidence is needed and how to properly develop a claim. A burned-out or brand-new processor is more likely to make procedural errors, request unnecessary or repetitive documentation, or simply deny the claim based on a lack of confidence in approving complex cases. This high turnover creates a fatal flaw in the system: case inconsistency. A veteran might have their claim reviewed by 3 different processors over 18 months. Each processor might have a different interpretation of the new rules, or they might request conflicting pieces of evidence. This means the veteran is constantly starting over, constantly having to re-explain their situation, and constantly facing delays because their file is being shuffled between inexperienced hands. The veteran feels like they are running on a treadmill, perpetually stuck in the development phase of their claim. For the first-time veteran who doesn't have the institutional memory to know when a request is unreasonable or incorrect, this inconsistency is devastating. They assume the VA employee is always right, and they waste months chasing down documentation that may not even be necessary, simply because the processor was confused or overwhelmed. This burnout factor directly translates into longer wait times, higher error rates, and a pervasive feeling among new veterans that the system is arbitrary and capricious. The reforms have focused on what the VA must process, more claims, new conditions, without adequately addressing who is doing the processing and how they are supported. The result is a system where the newest veterans are essentially being used as training material for a rotating cast of overwhelmed employees. The lack of consistency in claims processing is fundamentally unfair and undermines the veterans' trust in the system from day one. This internal crisis of staffing and morale is the invisible hand that is choking the efficiency and fairness of the VA. And until the VA addresses the underlying issues of workload, pay, and support for its employees, the first-time veteran will continue to be the primary casualty of the burnout factor. So, where does this leave the first-time veteran? They are entering a VA system that has been fundamentally reshaped by massive, necessary, yet poorly managed reforms. They face a new standard of gatekeeping that demands perfection in their initial claim. They are stuck behind the overwhelming volume created by the PACT Act paradox. They cannot access immediate mental health care because resources have been centralized into long-term programs. They face financial ruin due to the instability of the GI Bill's delivery system. They are targeted by predatory third-party consultants exploiting the system's complexity. And they are navigating a digital maze managed by burned-out employees who can't offer consistent guidance. The promise of veteran support remains, but the pathway to access it has become treacherous and confusing. If you are a first-time veteran, you must understand that the system you are entering is not the system your parents or even older siblings navigated. You must become your own most aggressive advocate. You must prioritize self-education over reliance on VA guidance. You must seek out accredited free VSOs immediately, understanding they are overwhelmed but still your best ethical resource. You must anticipate delays, budget for the unexpected, and document absolutely everything, treating your claim like the most important legal case of your life. The conversation needs to shift from celebrating reforms to demanding accountability for their implementation. We must pressure the VA to simplify the initial filing process, adequately staff VSOs, create financial buffers for student veterans, and provide robust, immediate, and accessible mental health care. The reforms themselves aren't the enemy. The unintended consequences of their rushed and under-resourced implementation are. We owe the newest generation of veterans more than just promises. We owe them a system that is functional, fair, and accessible when they need it most. The silent suffering of the first-time filer ends when we start talking about the reality of the new VA landscape. Don't let your transition be defined by these systemic failures. Educate yourself, fight smart, and demand the support you earned.